All right, everyone, we're going to try this again, and hopefully, I can bring on my new co host, Derek Walker. Um, so I'm not quite sure. It seems like Facebook has changed its features on having live broadcasts with guests. Um, all right, so I'm going to just kind of redo my introduction. I am your host, Nodella Jordan, author of The Intimate Place, My God, My Man, Myself, and Sassy, The Perfect Life. Intimate Talk live broadcast was inspired by my first book, The Intimate Place. And in the initial startup of the broadcast, which was last year, my desire and my goal was to bring on people who had purchased my book or had even read my book, and I wanted them to share their thoughts on the book. Well, because the book had been written almost 5 years ago, many of them didn't remember the contents of the book. They couldn't find their book. So it proved to be a little challenging for me to do that. And my goal was so you would know what the book was really about and to allow you to hear from firsthand knowledge of those who purchased a copy of my book. And so once again, it proved to be a little difficult or a lot difficult. So I kind of didn't continue with the broadcast except for spot live broadcasts here and there. And this year I wanted to take a different approach, and that is to bring on a co-host, which is Derek Walker. And the reason why I chose Derek Walker, because last year, if you go back into the archives, him and I did a broadcast, and he had very clear remembrance of what he read in the book, and he pretty much understood what I wrote and what I was saying in the book. And so I thought it would be befitting to bring him on as my co-host. Now, I will also be having other guest co-hosts in the future, but I wanted to bring someone on who had that connection in terms of, once again, really understanding what my book was about. And I just want to also let many of you know that my book is not just for women. I've had just as many men to purchase a copy of The Intimate Place, My God, My Man, Myself, than women. Many of them have expressed how much they enjoyed the book as well. And it was great to hear that it was refreshing, because my goal was, while I was writing the book, was to reach the men, to help them understand the woman's perspective concerning intimacy, concerning relationship. Derek, see if you can send me an invitation to join the broadcast. I don't know if you have that feature, if it's showing up on your end. If you can do that, then I can plug you in, because I'm not seeing the ability to bring you on. So can you check to see if you have a button or an icon that allows you to ask me to invite you onto the broadcast? Hopefully he can hear me, because he's saying hello. Oh, technology sometimes is great and sometimes it's not. So we're going to keep working on this, trying to get this together. Um, and so once again, I wanted men to get a bird's eye view, if you will, of what your average woman thinks about concerning intimacy, thinks about concerning relationship. But before we can even fully embrace that, one of the things that I brought to our attention, that's why the book is named My God, The Intimate Place, My God, My Man, Myself, because intimacy starts with God first. He is the one who created it. He created it for us so that we can also have a time of enjoyment as husband and wife. And I just really want us to have better relationships, not only with a significant other, but even with our families and with our friends. And a lot of us, as much as many of us avoid using the word intimate or intimacy, they're not realizing what the true meaning of intimacy is, or to be intimate, what it really means. And once again, so this is a relaunching of Intimate Talk, and Derek and I, we're going to have an open discussion. It's what I call a freestyling type broadcast, where we will have a topic of discussion, but we're not going to go line for line according to my book, but we're just going to talk about it, even share some of our personal experiences, and even reflect on our past failed relationships, and what is it that perhaps caused our relationships to fail. In my book, in chapter 3, in chapter 2, the My Man chapter, I talk about how I was married at one point many years ago, and I had to identify as well as admit that although we was married and although we said we loved each other, the key component that was missing, other than God, because he is the ultimate component, but the key component next to God was intimacy. And when I look back over our relationship, we really didn't have a lot of intimacy going on in our relationship. And don't forget, as I point out in my book, that intimacy is not about sex. Intimacy did not start with sex, and therefore it should not end with sex. And so, as I'm trying to multitask here. I'm trying to plug Derek in. So as we are talking about the broadcast on tonight, I want you to keep in mind that the whole purpose of me writing the book is to reaffirm that intimacy should not be focused or centered around sexual intimacy, but it really should be based on all of the components that makes up what real intimacy is. And so as we go into tonight's topic, which is called unconscious intimacy, I want to talk about how we have experienced times of intimacy, but we were unconscious to the fact that it was intimacy. I don't want us to continue to walk in the understanding of, once again, intimacy only being limited to sexual intimacy, but we have spiritual intimacy, we have mental intimacy, we have emotional intimacy, we have verbal intimacy, we have non-sexual physical intimacy, and then we also have the sexual intimacy. Now, I saw a guy who had said that there was 8 types of intimacy, and I didn't get into a conversation with him because the additional forms of intimacy he mentioned, they technically fall up under 3 of the others. So they are, if you will, sub intimacies, but everything pretty much is within these 5 types of intimacies, because he was talking about psychological intimacy. Well, that still falls up under mental intimacy. He was talking about your feelings, but feelings fall up under emotional intimacy. So I want us to come out of that unconscious state to intimacy and become more conscious about intimacy. I want us to be more purposeful. I want us to be more intentional about intimacy. And so tonight our subject is talking about unconscious intimacy, where oftentimes we may be riding the bus and we strike up a conversation with somebody we don't know, or we're in the line at the store, or we may be wherever it is we're at, and we have these pop-up conversations, if you will, or interactions with each other. And what we're not understanding is that those are moments of intimacy. And we just talk about these interactions as if they're just, interactions. excuse me. But we need to start identifying when we have conversations with people. We need to start identifying that we've had a moment of intimacy with that individual without feeling funny because somebody may immediately equate it to being sexual intimacy. And I can't begin to tell y'all how many people that I've had just last year alone, how many people I've had a conversation with. And as we was talking, I pointed out to them and I said, do you realize that we are having verbal intimacy? And they kind of looked and they was like, yeah. I said, it ain't neither one of us thinking about sexual intimacy. All right, I'm still trying to add my co-host, and I'm not sure how to do this. I'm trying to add my co-host. And so when I would bring it to their attention, they would be like, oh, okay. And so I purposely would point out to people I was having a conversation with, because I want us to come from that unconscious state and enter into a conscious state. And I want us to know and to be in a present state of mind of acknowledging, I just had an intimate conversation with someone. I just had mental intimacy with somebody. I just had emotional intimacy with somebody. And once again, when we began to talk about it, and I'm starting to hear the church talk about it a little bit more, start using that word a little bit more, but even the church, from the religious perspective, they was even avoiding using the word intimate or intimacy. And my thing of it is that if you are a Christian, if you are a believer, you cannot avoid using the word intimacy, not when you say you have a relationship with the Almighty God or with Almighty God. You can't avoid doing that, because then how are you able to have a relationship with him when he requires intimacy from you? And so it is from us, is that many of us, if not all of us, we truly desire intimacy. But once again, I'm not just talking about that sexual intimacy. Many of us desire to have that spiritual intimacy. Many of us desire to have that emotional intimacy, that mental intimacy, that verbal intimacy, that non-sexual intimacy. And non-sexual intimacy is that, maybe you're sitting on the couch and you're watching a movie or a TV show, and you might want to snuggle or cuddle. If you go for a walk, you're holding hands. Or if you're sitting at the table, having dinner, you both are sitting on the same side of the table instead of y'all sitting in front of each other. I know that's how I like to do. And so we truly have these desires, but society has made us to feel somewhat ashamed of having these desires, as if it's unnatural, as if it's wrong, and it's not wrong. And so I really want, through my book, to help us all to get back to that place of being conscious about having intimacy, reaching a point of telling our significant other, babe, I want to have a moment of intimacy, and your significant other will not immediately say, oh, she want to have sex, or oh, he wants to have sex. Absolutely not. When you have a relationship that is built on intimacy in its purest form, when one or the other say to the other, I want to be intimate tonight, their mind is not immediately going to go to sexual intimacy unless that's the vibe you're giving off. If you're not giving off the vibe that you want to have sexual intimacy, but you want to have verbal intimacy, so he or she will know, okay, my boo want to talk about whatever. And so you sit down and talk, whether it's in the house or wherever, but they will understand that you want to have verbal intimacy and not sexual intimacy, or you want to have emotional intimacy, and it actually is connected to the mental, the verbal, and the emotional, all those are connected, because if you have any of those, they all come into play. Because even when you have a moment of verbal intimacy, how many of us get passionate about the conversation we're having? I know for me, as I've shared in previous broadcasts, for those who really know I love football. And so anytime you talk to me about football, I become very passionate, and I tend to get loud like I am doing now. Why? Because I'm passionate. I'm being emotional about this broadcast to relay to you the importance of being conscious of every moment of intimacy that we have. We need to stop having accidental or coincidental moments or interactions of intimacy, but let us become more purposeful and intentional about having intimacy. I'm still trying to add my co-host. I don't know what is going on. I don't know how to add him. I'm trying to add him, but I am not being successful in adding him. It's telling me I can add a co-host, but it's not allowing me to add my co-host. So this is something I'm going to have to definitely work on for our next broadcast. And if anybody can tell me how to add a co-host, which I did, for some reason it's not coming through. But I want to continue on with the broadcast as well as he watches on. I did see him pop up here off and on. So what we were going to talk about is being intentional once again about intimacy. So I just want to share something to you that I wrote regarding unconscious intimacy. We experience moments of intimacy more unconsciously and unsolicited than consciously and solicited. Just think when you go to the store or take a taxi or even waiting in line at a restaurant, the random conversations we have with people we don't know, but also even with people that we do know. Those conversations should be identified as intimate, and more specifically, either verbal, mental, and or emotional. In order for us to create a life of intimacy, we must become intentional and purposeful again. I'm going to keep saying that because once again, tonight's topic of discussion is having unconscious and unsolicited intimacy. And our goal tonight in this broadcast is to shed light and to share once again our personal experiences and our personal thoughts and opinions on unconscious and unsolicited intimacy. Okay, so I don't see it on my side either, Derek. So we're gonna have to work on this for next week broadcast. But I truly appreciate you accepting being my co-host. And I was really looking forward to this broadcast tonight. So we're gonna have to figure out how to add that feature, because we both know it was a feature available in the past because we did a broadcast together last year. So in my reading, I'm going to finish my reading, is that in order for us to create a life of intimacy, we must become intentional and purposeful with each moment of intimacy. However, we first must understand what intimacy is or means. The Merriam-Webster dictionary's definition is: intimate is to be associated in close personal relations. I want to stop there before I finish the rest of the definition. How many times have we all had a close personal relation, but it wasn't sexual? It wasn't even to the point that we were in that kind of a relationship. We're talking about between family members. We're talking about friends. We're talking about co-workers. But even the stranger in the store, once again, we don't realize and we take for granted the relationships that we form with people in just those few moments of conversating. Even today, I was in the elevator at the parking garage at my job. And so I was in the elevator with one gentleman. He pressed floor number 3, but the elevator stopped at floor number 4. So he rushes out without realizing he was getting off the wrong floor. And then so another guy comes in. So we go down to the 3rd floor and it stops. So the guy looks out, he's looking around. I said, the guy who just got off when you was getting on, he was supposed to get off at 3. He pressed 3. I said, he didn't realize it. I said, but I guess he'll know now. And so we struck up maybe a 90-second conversation. We struck up a 90-second conversation. Do you realize that can be identified as a close personal relationship? Why? Because we was in I'm going to use this as somewhat of a rule of thumb. We were in a closed setting and it was only him and I talking. And not that either one of us was trying to have an intimate conversation, but once again, understanding what intimate means, understanding what intimacy means beyond sexual intimacy, you can understand why that anytime I have a conversation with someone, I label it as a moment or a time of intimacy. Only because of the passion that goes into it, only because of the relation that you just formed with the individual. So the next time this guy sees me, he gonna be like, I remember you, we were in the elevator and the guy got out and the elevator stopped on a different floor and yada, yada, yada. And so we formed a relationship at that time, but once again, it had nothing to do with sex. And so as long as we keep thinking of intimacy as being sexually oriented or sexually related or sexually restricted, we are, believe it or not, we're going to struggle in intimacy of it in of itself. Not even just in our relationships with our significant other, but in of itself. And so for those of you who's tuning in for the first time, that I shared how the intimate place, my God, my man, myself got started, was because I was tired of going to church and seeing church members struggle to be intimate with the God they say they know. And I'm like, that's like a husband struggling to be intimate with his wife. And I'm like, how can you say you know God, you have a relationship with God, but yet you struggle to be intimate with him in that time, in that place, and in that space? And so I said, God, I said, this needs to be addressed. I said, we got to fix your people struggling to be intimate with you at a time where intimacy should be free. You shouldn't be embarrassed about being intimate at that time with that significant other. You shouldn't feel strange or funny. You should be comfortable. And so I'm watching people who's supposed to be in a time of intimacy with God, but yet the slightest thing was pulling them out of that place. And I'm saying to myself, wait a minute. When a man and a woman comes together to be sexually intimate, and even non-sexually intimate, listen, when they are in that zone, the house can burn up around them because they ain't coming out that zone until they're ready to come out that zone. And I said, God, I said, how can we be so easily moved to come out of that zone that we're supposed to be in a time of intimacy? A time of intimacy is not a wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Those of y'all who grew up in my generation know exactly what that phrase means. That's not intimacy. That's just a quick fixer, whether it's sexual or mental or verbal or emotional. True intimacy, it takes time. And you don't rush in and you don't rush out. You stay there for as long as you need to stay there. And so I said, God, we need to fix this. And that was the start of my book, The Intimate Place, My God, My Man, Myself. I didn't leave the concern only with our struggle to be intimate with God, but we struggle in our relationships with our significant other, with our spouse, and even with ourselves, with our family, with our friends. And so let me finish reading the definition of intimate. So it says intimate is characterized by or involving a warm friendship or a personally close or familiar association or feeling. In Latin, it means a close friend. And so as I began to also think about the relationships that we have with significant others, how the divorce rate is just off the Richter scale. And I believe partly that is due because many relationships start off more so from the sexual intimacy perspective than it does any of the other. And so tonight, like I said, unfortunately, we're having an issue with my new co-host being able to come on, but I know he's rooting for me in the background. And hey, maybe next week, Derek, I'll let you do the full show by yourself since I did the full show this week by myself. But I wanted us to discuss tonight the unconscious intimacy, the unsolicited intimacy. When are we going to move to a point of being conscious about any form of intimacy? When are we going to solicit any type of intimacy that we desire without feeling weird, without feeling funny, or thinking that it's inappropriate? Because intimacy is never inappropriate for this fact. It is in every area of our life, whether we know it or not, or whether we want it to be or not, because God is the one who created intimacy for our enjoyment. It is in our DNA. We cannot get away from it. Now, people do suppress it because they say, well, I don't want to be in no more relationships. I'm not ever getting married again, or I'm never getting married. But it does not mean you have to forego the other forms of intimacy. Just because you don't want to be married or be in a relationship with a man or a woman doesn't mean that you don't have to experience the other types of intimacy. You can still enjoy spiritual intimacy. You can still enjoy mental intimacy. You can still enjoy emotional intimacy. You can still enjoy verbal intimacy and non-physical intimacy. Let's say if you have grandchildren, you mean to tell me you're going to forsake your grandchildren of a hug because you don't want to be in a relationship with a man or a woman? No, nobody in their right mind would do that. So when we limit and restrict ourselves because of bad relationships previously, not just with a significant other, but there's this thing, that's pretty much been on social media. People are talking about church hurt, which is the spiritual intimacy. People have been mentally, emotionally, and verbally abused. But we have to move away from that and not allow those past hurts to govern whether we allow ourselves to enjoy intimacy in the future. You don't have to do that because your intimacy, whether you realize it or not, is not based on that individual. It's based on you. Intimacy is not based on that significant other that is no longer your significant other. Your intimacy is not based on that friendship that you had that no longer exists, or that family member that you was tight with or you was close with that no longer exists. Intimacy, and I coined a phrase, make the intimate place your intimate place. And when you do that, you are removing the control from somebody else. And you are allowing yourself to have full control of your intimacy or your life of intimacy. And I want us also, as we go on in the broadcast, is to talk about moving from just having unconscious moments of intimacy, unsolicited moments of intimacy, to conscious and solicited moments of intimacy, but develop a life of intimacy, meaning that for no specific reason, you can have a moment of intimacy. It doesn't have to be for a special occasion. Now, I know a lot of people are gearing up for Valentine's Day tomorrow, but let us not fall into that misconception or that trap that only special occasions I can have intimacy. And that's not true. You can have intimacy as often as you want, whether it's by yourself or whether it's with others. And so we got to take that power and that authority out of the hands of others and say, well, since I'm not in a relationship, well, I guess I can't have intimacy on Valentine's Day. Watch me. Watch me have a whole bunch of intimacy on Valentine's Day. And like I said, let us not get stuck on, oh, she talking about having sex. No, that's not where my mind is. I'm not married. So as a Christian, as a minister, I have no business partaking in sexual intimacy with somebody who is not my husband. All right? But I can still have intimacy. Why can't I take myself to a restaurant? Why can't I take myself to the movies and watch one of my favorite movies, or even stay at home, cook my own Valentine's Day dinner, or cook a dinner for me? I got plenty of candles because I love scented candles. Listen, I had one of my candles lit earlier. I don't need to allow myself to continue to be restricted to society's perception or viewpoint of how you can and cannot have intimacy. Society is wrong that the only way you can have fulfilling intimacy is there always got to be somebody. That's not true. Because in chapter 3, the myself chapter, I dive into real specifically and I address the elephant in the room about how so many times we neglect ourselves of having personal intimacy because we're busy taking care of the husband. We're busy taking care of the children. We're busy taking care of nieces and nephews. We're busy taking care of maybe elderly parents or another elderly relative or disabled relative. And we neglect ourselves so much personally from that personal intimacy. You can have a personal moment of intimacy if you love jogging, if you love running, if you love exercising. Don't allow a bad situation to take that away from you. You continue to enjoy running. Okay, I understand they were your running partner, but guess what? They're no longer your running partner. Maybe if you continue to run, you might meet another running partner and things will work out. And I'm not talking about things work out in terms of you getting into that kind of a relationship, but just developing that kind of relationship. But the point of tonight's broadcast is that far too many times we have unconscious and unsolicited moments of intimacy. And I feel we take it for granted, and we should not take any form of intimacy for granted. It's really a blessing that we can experience such, how do you want to call it? Such a fulfilling act, if you will, in that, once again, it's not just about because you have a boo thing or you have a bae thing, but it's the fact that when you understand and truly appreciate what intimacy is, you'll be like, okay, hubby, or say, well, I'm going to hang with the boys. Bye. See you when you come back. Hey, go and have a candlelit bubble bath. Or if she say, well, I'm going to hang out with the girls. Okay, bye. Turn on the sports channel or whatever it is that you like to do. Even if you do have a spouse, it doesn't mean that all your time of intimacy has to be wrapped around them either. You both still should have your own time of intimacy. And so, as I come to a close in this broadcast, and I hope that y'all tune in next week, is that Don't take any future conversations that you have with anybody for granted. Acknowledge it as being a conversation of intimacy. And once again, not that it will lead to sexual intimacy. And like I said, I bring up as often as I can. When I get into a conversation with somebody, I immediately tell them, you know, we're having a moment of intimacy, right? You know, we're having verbal intimacy, right? And I'm like, it ain't nothing sexual about it, because I'm like, I'm especially when it's another woman. I'm like, because I'm not into women like that. And even if I'm talking to a man, listen, I'm not having this conversation because I'm trying to get with you. I'm just looking to have a good, wholesome conversation. And so when we become conscious of that, and when we start passing that on to other people, I guarantee y'all, every person who I did this to, I guarantee y'all that it changed their way of thinking when it comes to intimacy and having verbal intimacy. I guarantee you it changed their way of thinking. Because many of us just say, oh, I just had a really good conversation. No, you just had an intimate conversation, and sex has nothing to do with it. And even if sex did have something to do with it, my point is that I just want us to start being deliberate. I want us to start being intentional. I want us to start being conscious. I want us to start being purposeful in any form of intimacy that we have. Whether it's with a significant other, whether it's with God, because a lot of people, even with God, they take that intimacy for granted. Oh, because he's God. No. If you don't want anybody to take you for granted, then we shouldn't take him for granted. Don't take your partner for granted. And also don't let other people take you for granted, where you neglect yourself from having personal intimacy because you're too busy attending to them. And so my desire is to help us to get to that place, to start planning out purposely. Now, for those of you who may not know me, and for those of you who do know me, know at times I am a talker. I can be a chatterbox. When it's something that I love talking about, if it's something that's of interest, girlfriend is a chatterbox. This is why I'm also able to do these broadcasts, because I'm a chatterbox. And when I get into those conversations, people can see my passion about what we're talking about, even if I don't know much about it. But I inject myself into the conversation because I'm interested. And I don't want it to just be any kind of conversation. Oh, yeah, I just had a chit chat with so-and-so. No, because the intimacy within me has been awakened. And so every time I have a conversation with somebody, I immediately invoke intimacy in the midst of us, and they don't even realize it. But before the conversation is over, I make them aware. You realize we just had a conversation, a verbal intimacy. We also had mental intimacy, and we had emotional intimacy. And I leave it just like that, because I want them to think about what I said. I want them to start becoming more conscious about what I said. Yeah, I want you to go home and say, this woman told me that we just had verbal intimacy. And you go home, and let's say you go home and share it with your wife and say, I was in the elevator, and me and this lady was in the elevator. We just had like a 45-second conversation. And she told me we had verbal intimacy. And your wife may just turn around and say, that's what I want. Or your husband, you come home and tell it to your husband, and he said, that's what I want. And this is the thing, is that some of us are afraid to address the elephant in the room. Some of us are afraid to bring up the conversation of intimacy with our mate. because we're not sure how they're going to feel about it, then because it's never been a topic of conversation before. But at some point, it has to become a topic of conversation. At some point, you got to talk about intimacy. If that's what you are desiring in your relationship and you're not getting the right kind of intimacy, and once again, it's not about the sexual intimacy. You may just tonight, once again, you may just want emotional intimacy. And if you don't let your mate know that you want mental intimacy or emotional intimacy or verbal intimacy, sexual or non-sexual intimacy, then how will they know? And I'm talking about as a starter. Once you get into incorporating intimacy in your lives daily, there should then become a time when you shouldn't have to tell your partner as much, because your partner will pick up your vibes and will know, okay, she wants intimacy either with me, or she wants to have a time of intimacy either by herself, or she want to go hang out with her girls, and vice versa for the men. It works both ways. And so in future broadcasts with my new co-host, I am so excited, Derek Walker, we're going to be challenging each and every one of us about making sure we bring intimacy back into our relationships. Because if we bring intimacy back into our relationships, I'm telling you, it is going to make a world of a difference in your relationship. It really is. If you have not purchased a copy of my book, I got to put it in here. I want to encourage you to go and purchase a copy of my book. Tomorrow, my book normally goes for $9.99. Tomorrow, I'm going to mark it down at half price for anybody who wants a copy of my book. I have copies on hand, so if you order a copy from my website, I will send you an autographed and signed copy of my book, The Intimate Place, My God, My Man, Myself. And I am telling you, this book will change the way you look at intimacy. It will change the way you even look at your relationship with God, with your mate, with yourself, with your family, and with your friends. When I wrote this book, I took my time writing it because I wanted to make sure that I hit a lot of key points. And I wanted to make sure that my book really registered with people. I didn't write the book because I'm trying to become famous or rich. I wasn't thinking about writing a book. It was prophesied to me to write 2 books. And I said, oh yeah, I will when I retire. And God came back to me a year later. He caused me to lose my job. And I'm like, God, what is up with this? He says, I told you to write 2 books. I said, I am when I retire again. He says, no, I told you to write these books now. And I sat down, my first book, and I kid you not, I wrote that book in 10 days. I was able to write it in 10 days because I wasn't working. And so I would get up every morning as if I was going to work, and I would sit at that table for hours writing. And I guess that's why it only took me 10 days, because I would sit at the table writing the book. But I was very careful about the thought process and what I wanted in the book, because once again, I want to bring back the purity of intimacy into every single possible relationship we could ever have. When we try to have relationships without intimacy, I'm telling you, you're missing something. And some of you may say, well, I'm not missing it in my relationship. Add it to your relationship, and I guarantee you, you'll see a difference in your relationship. I guarantee you it will add depth. I guarantee you it will enhance. And I'm not only talking about your relationship with your mate. I'm talking about every relationship, whether it's with God, whether it's with your mate, whether it's with yourself, family members, friends, co-workers, even strangers. Like I said, every time somebody, if they say good morning to me, that opens the door. I don't just throw in their face saying, Oh, have you read about my book, The Intimate Place? No, 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 no. I don't even mention my book, but I do mention to them about how easy it was for us to engage in an intimate conversation. And nobody wasn't talking about come back to my place. Can I have your number where you live or nothing like that. Pure intimacy. And I'm telling you, I guarantee you, it will change your relationships, all of them. I want to thank everybody who tuned in tonight. Stay tuned for next week because we're going to have some real hot topics that we're going to be talking about. I just want to remind everybody that our broadcasts are live, obviously, and they are interactive, meaning that you can ask us questions during the broadcast. So this isn't just a broadcast where I'm talking. And I know many of you are tuning in tonight for the first time, but I want to encourage you to tune in next week. And I also want to encourage you to bring questions. Be sure to ask us questions even during the broadcast, because we are here to serve you. This broadcast is not about us. Once again, we're not trying to become famous or anything. This broadcast is about each and every one of you that tune in, about each and every one of you who will watch this replay. So thank you so very much for tuning in tonight. And I want to challenge each and every one of you who are still online and those of you who are going to watch the replay. I want to challenge you between now and the next broadcast to have an intentional moment of intimacy, whatever type it is. I want you to consciously create a moment of intimacy, no matter whether it's with someone or whether it's just for yourself. I want to challenge each and every one of you between now and the next broadcast. And I hope you do join me. And if you do join me, I want you to share. If you would, I want you to share by commenting on the broadcast what you did as your intentional intimacy, your purposeful intimacy, your conscious intimacy, your deliberate intimacy. I want you to post what you did intentionally. And like I said, whether it's with someone else or whether it's just you, I want you to, I challenge each and every one of you, because this is something every day I get up to do. I intentionally look to have a time of intimacy, once again, whether it's with somebody else or whether it's by myself. So everybody, have yourself a wonderful evening, and don't forget the challenge. Create an intentional moment of intimacy, whether it's with someone else or whether it's by yourself. And I look forward to hearing from you next week. Everybody, have yourself a great evening, and we will talk soon. Good night.